Well, the last time we spoke, we talked about the differences in the points of view between steep and flat IS, L, and LM curves. Okay. And I talked a little bit about monetarism in that context. They envision a very, very steep LM curve and a fairly flat IS curve, which makes monetary policy effective and fiscal policy not so much. But what I wanted to do today is to talk to you more specifically about the school of thought known as monetarism. It's impossible to really talk about monetarism without talking at length concerning its chief architect, Milton Friedman, University of Chicago economist, Nobel Prize winner in economics. And what he was known for was his macroeconomic theory of monetarism. But before we delve into that, let's talk a little more broadly about Milton Friedman and what he represents. He wrote a book that was fairly widely read by the public, and the book was called Free to Choose. It was turned into a PBS, public broadcasting service, documentary, and a lot of people watched that. Okay, so Free to Choose is not so much very strictly about monetarism, but it's giving you Milton Friedman's political economic philosophy. Free to choose. So he asserts that above all, people should be free to choose. And some of his positions were fairly radical, fairly extreme. People should be free to choose. Individuals are the best judge of what's good for them. So Friedman talked in terms of abolishing the Food and Drug Administration, for example, that drugs should be free to come to the market and consumers' tastes and preferences would dictate the drugs that survived, and the companies that survived by marketing drugs that were safe and effective, and those that were not safe and effective wouldn't pass the market test. So according to Milton Friedman, you really don't need the FDA. That's a pretty radical position. He was also firmly opposed to the licensing of professions, and that included the medical establishment, doctors, for example, that essentially people should be free to choose who they want to provide medical services. And if a doctor wasn't any good, okay, he'd fail the market test. He'd lose business if he's not prescribing or she's not prescribing effective treatments and remedies. So, no licensing, no mandatory educational credentials or anything like that. People should be free to hang out a shingle and call themselves a physician or a doctor, and it's still up to them to pass this market test. So those are some pretty extreme positions, but it gives you a certain idea of what Milton Friedman was all about in terms of his political philosophy. He didn't think that the federal government should have laws against things like pornography or prostitution or marijuana, things like that. That should be up to the states. And he thought this was consistent with his overall libertarian type of philosophy. Uh, we don't have a choice really about the country we live in. Americans aren't free to just go any place in the world to live and work in the same manner that people from other countries aren't free to come here and live and work without certain qualifications and obtaining green cards and things like that. So you're kind of like stuck in the country of your birth to a great extent. So there should be no federal law that circumscribes choice on those matters. Okay, so this is Milton Friedman's political philosophy. States, on the other hand, you're not bound to live in a specific state. You can go to live. You are free to work in any 50 states. A state can't bar migration into the state from another state, and you're free to work. You don't have to get a green card to move from Ohio to California, for example. You know, you're a citizen of the United States. You can live in any state or city, locality that you wanted. So, from Friedman's perspective, people who wanted a more, let's say, liberal approach to life, be it in terms of pornography, prostitution, pot, whatever, they can go settle in the states that, in cities that allow those things. And other states should be free to enact laws to restrict those very same things, because nobody has to continue to live in a state or a locality where they don't want to live, where that state or locality is circumscribing their freedoms. So just wanted to give you a brief little taste of Milton Friedman's political philosophy. Now, a lot of people these days, they take up the mantle of Milton Friedman's libertarianism, free to choose. They see him as a hero against federal government regulation, for example, Food and Drug Administration, things like that. But there are aspects of Milton Friedman's philosophy that a lot of these same people who claim him as one of their heroes don't too much talk about, okay? Milton Friedman was a proponent of the negative income tax. He was a proponent, in other words, of what is sometimes referred to as a guaranteed annual income, so that, you know, we have a floor that no one falls below. He favored that, okay? Proponent of a guaranteed annual income. He also would have thought of healthcare coverage for all people as a type of social insurance, and he saw government's role to do those things if the people so chose to have government perform that role, let's say. So another aspect of Friedman that's seldom talked about is laws, for example, against pollution and environmental damage and degradation. He didn't see these as problematic, as circumscribing the freedom of choice that he so much favored. Okay. Um, so he was not opposed to regulatory controls to protect the environment, protect ecology, so long as those same rules applied to all industries and it wasn't done in such a way to pick winners and losers, whereby you vigorously enforce the rules against pollution, um, targeting one industry, but give a freer rein to a different industry. Same rules, same regulations should apply across the board, and that way these environmental regulations would be not be used to pick winners and losers, so to speak. So yes, in certain respects, you can regard Milton Friedman as a conservative, a certain type of libertarian, but I don't know to what extent he would be happily embraced by the bulk of people who regard themselves as conservative today, at least not in terms of his total political philosophy. I mean, they might be quite thrilled with Milton Friedman, you know, being opposed to the FDA, and maybe by extension these days they might say, oh, Friedman would oppose mask wearing. I couldn't say that would be the case on the mask, but he did have these things to say about the FDA. He spent a lot of time kind of like castigating the FDA as a enemy of the people's freedom to choose. Okay, so that's a small taste of Milton Friedman's political philosophy. And if you would like to find out more about it, I would suggest that you read his book, Free to Choose. Anyway, moving on here to Milton Friedman's monetarism. Okay, Milton Friedman's monetarism. In a lot of ways, monetarism is a type of resurrection of the classical model, okay, in regard to the classical view of aggregate demand, okay. So the thing that the classicals hammered home again and again and again is this notion that only money shifts the aggregate demand curve. Well, Friedman didn't say that, okay? But what he did say is only money is capable of shifting the aggregate demand curve significantly, okay? So where the classical said only money matters, Milton Friedman would say only money matters significantly, okay? But it's a clever little subtle distinction. It makes Milton Friedman less extreme. On the other hand, what are we going to concern ourselves with? Are we going to concern ourselves with those things that are significant, or those things that are not significant? So if you say only money matters significantly, you're not putting out quite as an extreme statement as only money matters, period. Okay? It is a little subtle distinction where he's able to admit that other things play some role in shaping where the aggregate demand curve is. Government spending increases, tax revenue goes down. Well, you're going to get a little bit of shift in the aggregate demand curve, but it's not going to be significant. Okay? Only money is capable of shifting the aggregate demand curve significantly. Okay? So that's the monetarist thought in terms of aggregate demand. Okay? Well, if only money matters significantly, then only monetary policy is going to have a significant impact on the macroeconomy. Fiscal policy could play a role, it could do a few things, but it can't do anything that's truly significant. Therefore, the Friedman monetarist position in terms of fighting a recession, for example, would be rather than the government spend more or engage in tax cuts, discretionary fiscal policy to fight a recession, what should instead be done? Okay, well, hold off on what instead should be done because there's a monetarist prescription which applies to all situations, whether the economy is at full employment, beyond full employment, or below full employment. The Friedman monetarist position is, although monetary policy would be extremely effective in moving the aggregate demand curve in a significant kind of way, okay, you shouldn't do it, okay, because money is very powerful and the Federal Reserve is bound to make mistakes in the amount by which they change the money supply, okay? They'll make mistakes, and mistakes can set up a scenario, set up a circumstance where the cure is worse than the disease they're trying to cure. Huh? So, for example, if they're trying to fight a recession, they increase the money supply to fight a recession, it would be extremely effective. It would move the aggregate demand curve significantly. But if they make a bit of a mistake, if they overshoot, suddenly now the economy is going to be beyond full employment. Huh? Very effective in terms of moving the aggregate demand curve, but it makes it all the more likely that they make mistakes. They make a mistake, they overshoot, okay? Now you got a problem of the economy is overheated. It's operating beyond full employment. And then to correct for that, to fight the impending inflation, the monetary authorities put the brakes on the growth rate in the money supply. Maybe they do that a little bit too much, okay? Make the opposite kind of mistake, and now the economy's back into a deeper recession. So by the Fed making mistakes, by the monetary policy making mistakes, getting the amount by which they would need to adjust the growth rate, okay, they're going to cause the swings in economic activity, the ups and downs of GDP growth over time. Huh? They're going to make them. They're going to make the swing wider. The valleys are going to get deeper. The peaks are going to get taller. Okay, so the Fed makes mistakes in the magnitude by which they change the money supply or the rate of growth in the money supply. It makes the business cycle more pronounced. If they just left things alone, followed a fixed rate of growth rule for the money supply, in that case, well, the little ups and downs we would have would be because planned investment was going up or down, huh? Autonomous consumption going up or down. But there's not much of a multiplier effect here because although the interest rate isn't a perfect shock absorber like it was in the classical model, it's a really darn good shock absorber. There isn't that much of a multiplier effect because of changes in autonomous consumption, changes in planned investment, changes in government spending, changes in taxes. Not much of a multiplier effect. So little ups and downs. The Fed tries to get in there and counteract these little ups and downs. Okay, suddenly instead of riding a little roller coaster like from Kittyland, like the Beastie or something, now you've created the Beast or Diamondback at Kings Island. Deeper valleys, higher peaks. Okay, they made the situation worse. In addition to the likelihood that the Fed makes mistakes in magnitude, they could also make mistakes in timing. So, according to Friedman's monetarism, monetary policy, although it is effective, it impacts the economy with a lag. I mean, first the rate of growth in the money supply changes, or the money supply changes. Okay. Well, that affects short-term interest rates. The short-term interest rate change then impacts longer-term interest rates. And then it takes some time for the public, for consumers, to notice that, hey, interest rates are lower. Do I refinance? Do I buy a new home? Is it time to buy a new car? So in between the time the Fed makes the change in money, there's a 6 months to maybe a year and a half time lag where it actually affects consumer spending and in turn the macroeconomy. Okay, so if there's going to be like a little dip in GDP and the economy is contracting, the Fed does some sort of expansionary monetary policy. Well, when does that kick in? It doesn't kick in right away. It kicks in down the road, 6 months, year and a half from now. And by that time, the economy might not any longer be in a dip. It might be in a upswing. So in order to get this correct, if the Fed was trying to fine-tune the economy, these little ups and downs due to other things other than money, okay, they're going to use money to try to counteract that, okay, not only do they have to get the right amount, the magnitude of the change in money required, they got to get their timing correct. If they don't get their timing correct, well, then they're also, their cure is going to be worse than disease, huh? They're going to turn the little beastie into the beast or the diamondback, huh? So they advocate a fixed rate of growth rule for the nation's money supply. Okay? Only money matters significantly. This is the essence of monetarism. Okay? And we will spend a good deal of time talking about monetarism. So, last lecture, we talked about monetarism in terms of ISLM, right? So you have this very steep LM curve and a fairly flat IS curve. In that case, if the IS curve shifts, let's say specifically it shifts to the right because of an increase in government spending, a cut in taxes, an increase in autonomous consumption, an increase in planned investment, an increase in net exports, okay? If the IS curve shifts for any of those reasons, okay, along a fairly steep LM curve, as we showed last lecture, okay, the change in Y, the change in real GDP, the change in the level of aggregate demand is not significant. What does cause a big change in Y, real GDP, the level of aggregate demand, is a change in money, because that's shifting the LM curve along a relatively flat IS curve, and you get a big change in national income. You get a big change in real GDP. So let's take a look at the graph here. So here it is. So, and let me point this out as I show you the graph. You know, at least in the short run, okay, in the short run, the monetarists aren't trying to resurrect the classical model in terms of aggregate supply. Their view of aggregate supply, like the Keynesians, is, oh, the aggregate supply curve has positive slope. There it is. Short-run aggregate supply curve. Their difference with the Keynesians would be that Keynesians would see, oh, a big shift in aggregate demand from here to here because government spending increased or taxes were reduced. Monetarists would see a little shift, okay, little shift in aggregate demand. You only get a big shift in aggregate demand if money changes, if there's a increase in the money supply, So Milton Friedman's monetarism, okay. There's another aspect to monetarism, and this is also like a resurrection of another aspect of the classical thinking, the classical model. One of the pillars of the classical model was that classicals favored a balanced budget. Government spending should be equal to tax revenue. So for Milton Friedman and the monetarist, since fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, isn't really going to work significantly to fight a recession, government shouldn't be running deficits. Government also shouldn't run surpluses. You shouldn't try to use fiscal policy to fight an inflationary gap either. Okay? You don't run surpluses, you don't run deficits, you focus on a balanced budget, huh? Fiscal policy, whether to fight a recession or fight inflation, is just not that effective. Okay? So you don't use fiscal policy to stabilize the macroeconomy, okay? Because fiscal policy just doesn't do good. It doesn't have a significant impact. So focus on a balanced budget. You don't use monetary policy to fight a recession or fight inflation, because monetary policy is too effective. And if you try to use it, you'll make mistakes, and the mistakes will cause a bigger problem than what would have been there had you just left things alone. Instead, follow a fixed rate of growth rule for the money supply. Announce what that growth rate rule for the money supply is going to be, and then stick to that rule. Okay? And yes, you'll have some ups and downs. But the ups and downs we have, you go look at the economic data, the ups and downs we have, according to monitors' thinking, are because the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, was trying to use monetary policy to right the wrongs, okay, the ups and downs of the business cycle, and they made mistakes and made things worse. Follow a fixed rate of growth rule, you'll just have little ups and downs. And that's the best we can do, okay? The cause for the big ups and downs, including the Depression, according to Milton Friedman, was the Federal Reserve doing the wrong thing at the wrong time with the nation's money supply, with the rate of growth in the money supply and the various tools of monetary policy.